Thank you for your patience. It's good to see such a great turnout today. I hope we have a wonderful evening. On behalf of the Department of Religion Studies and the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Johannesburg, I welcome you to today's discussion, Exploring Religious Belief, a Muslim Atheist Conversation. You will have noted that we are envisioning today's event as a conversation, a discussion, not a debate per se. We find ourselves in an academic setting, and the purpose of this singular space, the academy, is to foster good faith conversations, often difficult ones, about life's deepest and most important questions. This is where we can engage in free and open dialogue in the spirit of seeking. I don't know how to get the light. In the spirit of seeking truth, there was a spirit there. I don't know how to get the light on. Not imposing our views on others, and certainly not censoring the views of those with whom we disagree. We also find ourselves in Africa, a continent with the rich philosophies around the importance of fostering communal dialogue around matters of great importance. And the matter of religious belief is of great importance, is it not? Indeed, we can consider religion to be that quintessentially human activity of engaging with matters of ultimate importance. But it will not have escaped the attention of anyone in this room that the approaches and answers to these questions widely differ. And where we have such wide divergences, conflict can result, and has resulted time and time again throughout human history. Today we take one small step toward perhaps breaking this cycle, but let us not be naive, it won't be easy. Religious questions arise from the very core of what it means to be human. You may vehemently disagree with one or more or all of the speakers today, even the chair. But I hope you can find the courage to accept that free and open conversations about truth must be fostered if humanity has any chance of moving toward a new, more tolerant and tolerable future. With that said, allow me to briefly introduce you to our four esteemed panelists. Hamza Andreas Jordis is the founder and CEO of Sapiens, of the Sapiens Institute. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism, which has been translated into over 10 languages. He has a Master's of Research degree, an MA, and a postgraduate certificate in philosophy from the University of London. He is currently pursuing his PhD on the Quran and its verses pertaining to nature. He has studied Islamic thought and theology under qualified scholars. Hamza has spoken at many universities all around the world. He has debated prominent academics and thinkers on Islam and atheism. His interlocutors have included Professor Lawrence Krauss, Professor Peter Simons, Dan Barker, and Professor Simon Blackburn. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Muhammad Ijab is an author, comparative religionist, and philosopher of religion. He is co-founder of the Sapiens Institute and is a researcher and instructor for the organization. He has a BA in politics and a master's degree in history. He has also acquired a second master's in Islamic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He has also completed a third master's degree in applied theology from the University of Oxford, where he focused on the philosophy of religion in applied settings. He is now doing his PhD in the philosophy of religion on the contingency argument for God's existence. In addition, he has undergone formal training in Islamic studies with a focus on the Quran, prophetic traditions, and legal reasoning. He has completed Islamic seminary courses and has been given formal permission to relay Islamic knowledge on selected Islamic fields. He is one of the very few Muslim public figures who deal comparatively with political, philosophical, and theological issues, and as such has amassed a following of many subscribers on YouTube in English and Arabic. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Aaron Fasser, is a practicing advocate and member of the Johannesburg Bar, and a self-described philosophy enthusiast. Aaron graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand in 2007 with a BA cum laude, and in 2009 with an LLB cum laude. Aaron has also graduated with an MA in Applied Ethics cum laude in 2017 and has an MA in Philosophy cum laude in 2019. He has also been awarded his LLM International Law cum laude in 2021 at the University of the Witwatersrand. He has appeared in a number of cases that have been reported in the South African law reports. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Last but not least, we welcome Mark Oppenheimer. He is a practicing advocate and a member of the Johannesburg Bar. He has appeared in the Supreme Court of Appeal and the Constitutional Court in a series of cases that seek to determine the boundary between freedom of expression and genuine hate speech. He has authored submissions to Parliament on the hate speech bill and to the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on Escalating Racial Tensions. He is co-author of the Conversations About Philosophy book series and hosts the popular philosophy series Brain in a Vat. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Here quickly is the format of today's event. We will start, of course, with me giving you this introduction. Once I'm done, each of the panelists will present for 15 minutes each. We will then move to an internal discussion amongst the panelists that should go for around 30 minutes. Then we will have a more open discussion. That session will be around 25 minutes. That will include our esteemed panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. They will respond and get the conversation rolling in a different, or continue the direction that was started with the internal discussion. And then we'll let you, the audience, ask questions and comments for around 15 minutes. And may I please ask you to keep it brief and concise and, of course, civil. And we will end with a quick fire round. Each of the panelists can conclude in 1 minute. Just give us your concluding thoughts. I will send you off, but before that we have some gifts for the panelists. Once those gifts are given off, I will thank all of you, and we will all go home hungry. That is my hope. Hungry for more conversations about these matters of vital importance. So with that said, let me introduce you to the panelists, and then we'll get the ball formally rolling. To my left, I have the head of department and senior lecturer in philosophy, Dr. Chad Wynne Harris. Welcome. And then we have Dr. Shahid Mati, senior lecturer at the Department of Religion Studies. Welcome. We are going to go straight into the panel discussion now, which should last us around 40 minutes. And we are going to begin by agreement of the panelists that we will start with Aaron Fasser. So Aaron Fasser, your 15 minutes begin now. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about these matters of all importance.
Thank you. I would just like to start by thanking the organizers of this event, namely the Philosophy of Religion and the Religious Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg, as well as the Sapiens Institute. It's a great privilege to share the stage with such esteemed, learned interlocutors. Conversations like this are vitally important, not only because the topics that arise are themselves intellectually stimulating, but because they allow us all an opportunity to gain some insight into the worldviews and beliefs of people vastly different from ourselves. This attempt to deepen one's understanding is at the heart of philosophical discourse. The philosopher Gyula Klima captures the nature of what we're doing here tonight, and he sums it up in a quote. unless one is able to learn to think and live with the concepts of another person and thought objects constituted by them, one will always fail to have a real grasp on the meaning of the other person. This, however, need not mean that people can understand only those persons all whose beliefs they share. What is required for proper understanding is rather the ability to let the other person's beliefs constitute one's own universe of thought objects, trying to achieve a fusion of the horizons. This can be done, however, only in a long dialectical process, which may take adjusting the beliefs of either party. We should not seek sheer winning of a debate, for that is the concern of sophists, but to win over the other to one's belief, and or to be won over to the other's belief, for the sake of what is true and good. But this, of course, requires openness, patience, and respect from both parties. Indeed, this requires that attitude which defines our profession, the love of wisdom. So with that in mind, I'd like to address two aspects in my opening address. The first relates to my understanding of tonight's discussion topic and the concept of rationality. The second relates to my reasons for thinking that atheism is a more rational philosophical position than Islamic theism. The topic for discussion this evening is atheism or Islam, which is more rational. However, what are we to understand by the term rational? There are, broadly speaking, two concepts of rationality that need to be disambiguated. The first is alethic or epistemic rationality, which is concerned with truth tracking, and that set of reasons or justifications which properly bear on the truth or falsity of someone's belief. The second is pragmatic rationality, which is concerned with the utility of a given set of beliefs in achieving a person's stated goals. It is my understanding that the principal concern this evening is in determining whether atheism or Islam is more rational in the alethic or epistemic sense rather than the pragmatic sense. Accordingly, I understand this evening's topic is about whether there is greater epistemic reason to believe that atheism or Islamic theism is true. So why do I believe that atheism is true? Before I can do that, I need to get some definitions on the table so that we're all clear about what we're talking about. By God, I understand to be the single, necessary, transcendent, supernatural, immaterial, non-physical person that exists that is to say independently, and is essentially omniperfect. He's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and thus worthy of worship, and who is the creator, designer, and sustainer of the natural world. Atheism is the thesis that the proposition God exists is false. Theism is the thesis that the proposition God exists is true. Naturalism is the thesis that the proposition only the natural world exists is true. Naturalists are committed to the idea that 1, there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. And 2, our best, most well-established science is the best touchstone for what those natural causal entities and items are. Naturalism logically entails that natural reality exhausts global causal reality, and it logically entails atheism. However, atheism does not logically entail naturalism. Supernaturalism is the thesis that the proposition only the natural world exists is false. Supernaturalism posits a bifurcated ontological view of reality. Theism entails supernaturalism, however, supernaturalism does not entail theism. Supernaturalism is committed to all the causal entities that the naturalist is committed to, plus the existence of non-natural causal items with non-natural causal powers. Supernaturalism thus entails that global causal reality is not exhausted by natural reality. By Islamic theism, I understand this to be the idea, the claim that God, as I've defined him, also has the property of having progressively revealed through the Archangel Gabriel the contents of the Quran to Muhammad, and which contents are the final and definitive revelation for mankind. Islamic theism logically entails theism. Theism does not logically entail Islamic theism. I am an atheist and a naturalist. I reject theism, and a fortiori I reject Islamic theism, for two principal reasons. First, the arguments for the existence of God are philosophically unpersuasive. We can call this the negative reason. Second, there are, in my view, persuasive arguments for atheism and for naturalism. This is the affirmative reason. The negative reason flows from the fact that atheism is justified in virtue of the failure to infer God's existence in circumstances where one would rationally expect his existence to be inferable. Absence of evidence can indeed be evidence of absence, justifying the conclusion that something does not exist. This will be the case provided at least two conditions are jointly met. First, if the thing X exists, then there would be evidence of X's existence. And 2, we have conducted an exhaustive search for the evidence in the areas where such evidence ought reasonably to be found. When applied to God, condition 1 is generally accepted by all parties to the discussion. After all, if God does exist, then we all, atheists and theists alike, rationally expect there to be evidence of his existence, given the sort of being God is supposed to be. If we do not rationally expect evidence of his existence were he to actually exist, then it is quite difficult, if not impossible, to see how one could rationally argue for his existence in the first place. In fact, the project of natural theology assumes that there would be evidence of God's existence, and if he were to exist, that we can in fact marshal that evidence. Condition 2, when applied to God, amounts to dealing with the best arguments from natural theology. These are the theistic arguments that often invoke the input and insights of contemporary science, that are supposed to take up the mantle and provide the positive evidence from which to infer God's existence. Examples include the cosmological argument, the contingency argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, etc. We can proffer the following deductive argument which takes the above considerations into account. Premise 1. If God exists, then there is compelling evidence from which to infer either deductively or non-deductively his existence. In other words, the arguments from natural theology are sound. Premise 2. There is no compelling evidence from which to infer either deductively or non-deductively God's existence, i.e. the arguments of natural theology are not sound. Therefore, premise 3, conclusion, therefore God does not exist. The argument is logically valid. Of course, theists will vehemently deny the soundness of premise 2. That's where the action is, so to speak. And it means that the theist must offer positive reasons from which to infer God's existence. If there is no evidence for God when we ought rationally expect there to be evidence, then we are within our epistemic rights to conclude that God does not exist and that atheism is true. The affirmative reason for atheism is tied to a panoply of positive arguments. Because of time constraints, I can't deal with all of them. I'm going to list the family of arguments, and then I'm going to provide one specific argument that I think is quite powerful. The first family of arguments seeks to demonstrate a logical incoherence in the very concept of God, either because a supposed divine property of God taken on its own is logically impossible, or because some set of supposed divine properties is logically incompossible. The second family of arguments seeks to demonstrate that the existence of God is logically incompossible with the existence of certain undeniable facts about the natural world. For example, 1, the existence of horrendous evil and suffering in the world, or 2, the existence of non-resistant non-believers, or 3, the existence of doxastic discord and religious heterogeneity. The third sort of argument is non-deductive in character, and seeks to demonstrate not that the existence of God is incompossible with these facts, but rather that the existence of God is a poor explanatory hypothesis, when the aforegoing facts and others besides are taken into consideration, cumulative consideration. The idea is that on a conspectus of all the relevant data, the naturalistic hypothesis explains the data better than the theistic hypothesis. It is obvious that if one has a choice between two competing theories, and the one is better at explaining the relevant data, then it is more rational to accept that theory. What then constitutes a better theory or explanation? I contend that it is one that has the greatest explanatory scope and depth, while also being the most parsimonious. The core idea is that naturalism can explain all the relevant data at least as well as theism, and it is by its very nature more parsimonious than theism. After all, theism posits the natural world plus something more. I contend that naturalism can explain the existence of the universe, the so-called fine-tuning of the universe, consciousness and morality at least as well as theism can. Furthermore, naturalism can better explain a host of more specific facts about reality that are not well explained by the theistic hypothesis. For example, and I've already alluded to this, the scope, distribution, and quantity of horrendous suffering in the world, both animal and human. 2, the existence of non-resistant non-believers. 3, the existence of doxastic discord in the form of widespread religious heterogeneity. And 4, the continued and repeated success of naturalistic explanations in displacing supernaturalistic explanations over the course of human history. Turning then to the specific argument that I'd like to present. There are many more, but time constraints only permit this one. It's the form of the logical argument from evil presented by J.L. Schellenberg, and what he calls the new logical argument from evil. J.L. Schellenberg explains the central thrust of this version of the argument to be the following, quote, "Theists must rationalize from God without evil prior to creation, prior here may be taken logically or temporally or in both senses, to God with evil after. No such transition, so it may be argued, is metaphysically possible. The key thought can be put in the form of a slogan. In any possible world, including God, once purely good, always purely good. What we have here is something like the theological analog of Newton's first law of motion. Another way of putting it is no evil before creation, no evil after. The premises of the argument are as follows. 1. God is unsurpassably great. 2. God is ontologically independent of any world that he creates. 3. Prior to any world being created, there is no evil in God of any kind. There are only divine goods. This is the prior purity of God. Therefore, 4. Every possible non-divine good is greatly exceeded by a good of the same type existing in God prior to the world. Therefore, 5. Every worldly good is greatly exceeded by a good of the same type existing in God prior to the creation of the world. 5. Therefore, every worldly good, 6. All goods found in God prior to the world are pure goods. They are goods that exist without any evil whatsoever. 7. Therefore, every worldly good is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the existence of the world. Therefore, 8. Every worldly good that may permit or require evil is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the world. Therefore, 9. If every worldly good that permits or requires evil is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the world, then any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by any world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God. Therefore, 10. Any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by any world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God. This would be a greater world. God can ensure the existence of such greater worlds and can do so limitlessly. Therefore, if A, any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by a world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God, and B, the existence of greater worlds can limitlessly be ensured by God, then for any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create X rather than world Y. For any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create world X rather than world Y. Therefore, 14. If for any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create X rather than Y, then God has no good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 15. Therefore, God has no good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 16. But if there is evil in the world, then God has good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 17. Therefore, there is no evil in the world. 18. However, as we all know, there is evil in the world. 19. The conclusion. Therefore, there is both evil and not evil in the world, which is a contradiction. As J.L. Schellenberg concludes, having derived this contradiction in the way that we have, it follows that the conjunction of the three commitments of theism mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, unsurpassable greatness, ontological independence, and prior purity, are logically consistent with a fourth undeniable fact, namely the existence of evil in the world. That concludes in essence my presentation, and obviously I look forward to discussing the merits on the details of those arguments in the course of our discussion. Thank you very much.
Next, as per agreement of the panel, we will hear from Mohammed Hijab. Let me just stop that, restart. Please go ahead.
Let's suppose there is no God. Let's suppose there is no omniscient one, no omnipotent one, no all-knowledgeable one, no all-powerful one, no necessary being. Let's suppose, no problem. What do we have? What are the explanations that we have? That the universe came from nothing. But we know from nothing, nothing comes, because nothing is the absence of something. that the universe is self-generated. But we know that that's a contradiction, because the universe cannot generate itself, exist and not exist at the same time. So what do we know? What do we know? We know there exists a universe. We know I exist. We know you exist. We know Oppenheimer exists. And Fraser exists. And hopefully there's not going to be explosions today. Except of the argument that we've just heard. And I will say that when you know that the dependent existences exist, you have two options. Either you have a chain, a finite chain. A depends on B, or B depends on A, C depends on B. In which case A is the beginning of that chain. We, the Muslims, call that the necessary being, the independent one, God. Obviously the atheist cannot subscribe to that theory. Let's move away from that one, please. So what do we have left? We have an infinite chain. An infinite chain of dependent things. But an infinite chain of dependent things is an absurd proposition. The reason being, because if this was actualized in the actual world, for example, through an infinite amount of multiverses, then it would imply that the inexhaustible has been exhausted. The unlimited has been limited, which is a contradiction, which is absurd. It would also imply that infinite sets exist within infinite sets, which means that the part is equivalent to the whole, but the part is defined by most mereologists as a portion of the whole, which is an absurdity itself and a contradiction. So let's suppose God doesn't exist. What can you atheists actually present and put on the table? You've got nothing. And the best Mr. Faisal could actually put to the table is to say, naturalism can explain just as well, he says. He's not even trying to say it's better. He's trying for equality. He's got a Nelson Mandela approach to the situation. He does. But so do I, in a different manner. Because in an intellectual way, we will conclude, therefore, that a necessary being through which everything depends upon is independent in and of itself, and everything depends upon is the only way to make sense of dependent things. You see, contingent things cannot exist within necessary things. A contingent thing is possible, can exist or not exist. A necessary thing is not possible, it's impossible not to exist. In other words, contingencies cannot exist within necessities. The existence of dependent things, the existence of this young man here, the handsome one, and Oppenheimer, his forefathers led to a lot of people's non-existence. Not your forefathers, but you know, the other Oppenheimer. Their existence indicates without shadow of a doubt that a necessary being is required. So what kind of necessary being is this? We know I'm different to him, and we know he's different to him, and we know you're different to him. Differentiation indicates possibility and contingency. And wherein there is differences and possibility and contingency therein, there must be an explanation for this. And what is the explanation for this? Islamic theism says, an external sorting agent, which specified and particularized things to be a certain manner, which indicates a choice had to be made. And this, we would say, indicates a chooser, a willer, which we would say is the will of God. So already we've identified that you have to have something which is independent and necessary, post-eternal and pre-eternal, to break away from the infinities and have a will. What do we call that? We call that God. Yes, we do. And it's the only explanation that doesn't lead to contradiction and absurdity. I challenge anybody here today to give me another explanation that doesn't lead to contradiction and absurdity. You see, I finished quite early
You have about 10 minutes.
I've got more to say. I've got more to say, which is, okay, you say fine. I understand the situation. I agree with you, no problem. But why do you say that Islam is true? Before we get there, one more prerequisite must be made. How could there be only one of these? How come there's not three? For example, the triune situation. Because if there was an individuating factor that individuated and differentiated necessary being A from necessary being B, that would render either or both of them contingent. Because a contingent thing is differentiated in reality. And a necessary being cannot be differentiated from something else. But I'll give you an easier argument, which is the Quranic argument. مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Chapter 23, verse 91, that there couldn't be more than one God effectively because they would outstrip one another in power. There cannot be more than one overall power because an all-powerful agent by definition, yes, means that he has power over all other things. Nothing can supervene on his power capabilities. Moreover, there cannot be more than one overall will. لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. In chapter 21, verse number 22. If there was in them, i.e. the heavens and the earth, more than one, the heavens and the earth would have been corrupt. Meaning what? You have to have one overriding will. Because it had been more than one will, it wouldn't be consistent. You couldn't explain the uniformity, the regularity, the stability of the universe. Because there is uniformity, stability, and regularity. Without it, you couldn't even do science. And there is uniformity, stability, and regularity to the extent which it allows life to exist on the universe. That's a fact no one here will deny. There is life on the universe, and that the universe is uniform and regular and stable enough to allow such life to exist. What is the best explanation for this? One singular overarching will that doesn't lead to conflict. So that's why it's one God. But what about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Now there's many things I can say, and in 7 minutes I'll just mention one evidence. There are necessary and sufficient conditions for a word of God to be conceived as such, the word of God. I would put to the table today that one of the necessary conditions is that this cannot contain any contradictions. We are logicians here, the Quran says if this was from other than God, it would have been many contradictions inside of it. لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. The Quran, this is one of the necessary conditions. It's one of the only books to even posit this challenge, religious books, which is find the contradiction within it. Secondly, it's inimitable. Thirdly, it's preserved. We will argue all these points. However, what's the sufficient condition? I give you one argument and one argument only, which is the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now I am claiming here, and I'm willing to be challenged today, that the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are the most accurate and numerous and frequent that come from an integrous source and unambiguous in human history. These five criterion that I've just mentioned, if you apply them to any other historical figure, it will collapse. For example, if you look at the Bible, Mark chapter number 13, you'll find that it says in one generation the heavens and the earth will be destroyed. Nostradamus made a prediction that in 177 years there will be famine and war and so on. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made the following predictions. For example, I'll give you some. That the barefooted Arabs يَتَطَاوَلُونَ فِي الْبُنْيَانِ, that they will compete to see who creates the highest buildings. Now, we're seeing that the highest building in the world is in Burj Khalifa. How could the economic capabilities of these nations be such that if someone wanted to argue this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it was such? It couldn't be. Number two, that the Prophet ﷺ predicted the fall, the downfall of the Persian and the Roman Empire, the two greatest empires of that time, spanning millennia. Not only that the Muslims would overtake those empires. Number three, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ predicted the invasions of the Mongols. And I'm ready to give all the primary sources. It's very well known in the Islamic tradition. He told us how the Mongols would invade, and one of the biggest battles in Muslim history was Ain Jalut in 1260. The sacking of Baghdad was in 1258, and this is all connected to the prophecies of the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us what kind of world we'll be living in. He said, the world in the future will be such that there will be so much interest. مَنْ لَمْ يَأْكُلْهُ أَصَابَتْهُ مِنْ غُبَارٍ. Whoever doesn't consume the interest, he will be affected by its dust. We're living in an economic system, the whole thing is interest, women busters, perpetuated or exacerbated at least by the interest systems of the banks. I think South Africa is no different. Number 5, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us that there will be an advent of sexually transmitted diseases due to an increased fornication. Number 6, the Prophet ﷺ told us that women will go into the workforce. Yes, I'm not sure if any of you have heard this one. حتى تعين المرأة زوجها في التجارة. This is a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The woman will involve herself in business with her husband. This is a prophetic hadith. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ even told us about obesity that will become a phenomenon within his ummah. And many people in this room, I'm only kidding, says, you see what I mean? The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us exactly where Islam is going to spread. زُوِيَ لِيَ الْأَرْضِ, he said, فَرَأَيْتُ مَشْرِقَهَا وَمَغَرِبَهَا وَإِنَّ أُمَّتِي سَيَبْلُغُ مُلْكُهَا مَا زُوِيَ لِي مِنْهَا. That the earth has been projected to me and I saw its eastern parts and western parts, and all of the ummah will take what has been projected. Why does he say east and west and not north and south? Look at the map. He told us exactly where Islam will spread. He said it will go to Sindh al-Hind. It will go to India and Pakistan. He told us it will go to Egypt. He told us it will go to Asham, Jordan and Lebanon and these countries. Yemen. How could somebody get this so right? There's been no figure in human history who has predicted with such frequency and unambiguity the events of the future as Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And these are just some examples. I could go on for 2 hours. And books have been written. Volumes, voluminous books have been written. Encyclopedic, compendious, voluminous books have been written on the issue. I'm not going to talk about that today. I've just given you as much as you need. Now to respond to my interlocutor quickly. He's talking about the problem of evil. He had 2 arguments effectively. One of them was disagreement, religious disagreement. Effectively, and I don't want to straw man and make it correct, saying the existence of religious disagreement means there's no God. What the hell is this? Sorry to say. وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. Quran says, if Allah wanted, He could have made the people one people. وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلَفِينَ. And they are in fact continually disagreeing. وَلِذَلِكَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ. Except for who Allah has rahmah on. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And that's the reason why He created them in the first place. He created you as a test, my friend, to see of you which is going to be good and bad. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. This is no argument against us. This is actually in line with God's wisdom and mercy. And He says evil, the problem of evil, which we've heard 1,000 times before. I disbelieve in evil. How about that? I believe evil is privation. I don't believe evil is substratum. Put evil under a microscope. Atheists, tell me where evil is. Evil is privation, is the lacking of God's goodness. That's what I say evil is. Tell me where evil is. Let me use empirical value judgment to show where the substance of evil is. Evil doesn't exist. How about that? As an atheist, you don't believe in God, but you believe in evil. But you can't put evil under a microscope empirically. What ontological status does evil have? How can you use the existence of non-existence to try and disprove the existence of the necessary existence? It's a waste of time. And we've got 20 seconds here. And in that time, I will just recite Quran. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, which is, say He's Allah, one and only, Allahu Samad. The one who everyone depends upon, He depends upon nothing. لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. He begets not, nor is He begotten. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There's nothing like Him. جزاكم الله خير.
Our next panelist is Mark Oppenheimer.
Well, I thought that was a marvelous place to end off, talking about the question of evil. While Aaron has spoken about the arguments for and against the existence of God, I'm going to talk about why atheists can talk about the existence of morality and why they give a better account of morality. Now, the first place to start is to say, well, what would a good moral theory look like? Well, firstly, we should know what it requires of us. In other words, the theory tells us what we ought to do in the world, what's permissible, what's not permissible. It should cohere with our ordinary intuitions. So if it prohibits things that we think are good or neutral, that's a problem for the theory. If it allows things that we think are repugnant or bad, that's also a problem for the theory. It must be consistent. The theory mustn't be at odds with itself. It shouldn't require you to do X and also not X. We also think that it should be universal, that we can take the moral theory and we can apply it across history and across the world, and we can make moral judgments, and it'll tell us that certain things were wrong, even if people at the time believed them to be right. So, for example, it was the case that throughout human history, slavery was practiced. A lot of people believed that slavery was a moral practice, and a good moral theory should tell you that those people were wrong, that slavery is always wrong and can never be justifiable. So that's what a good moral theory should do. Now, Hamza has in his book a theistic account of what morality requires of us and what a good moral theory is, and the claim is really that God is the foundation of morality. And he takes the divine command theory approach. So we say whatever God commands, that is what's right. Now, this is dealt with in what's called Euthyphro's dilemma. There's two horns of the dilemma. The first is it good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it is good? Sorry, there's a terrible beeping sound. If someone could turn that off, I'd really appreciate it. So, the horn dilemma is, does God command it because it is good? Or is it good because God commands it? Now, if it's good because God commands it, you run into this arbitrariness problem, which is that God could command anything. God could say, kill the firstborn, and it would be good because God had commanded it. God could say that the right thing to do is wear purple underwear on a Tuesday, something that we think is neutral, and it would be good because God commands it. So there's the arbitrariness problem. If you take the other horn of the dilemma, which is that God knows what is good, and therefore that's why he commands it, then the foundation of morality doesn't stem from God's commands, but it's external to God. Now, in his book, Hamza takes another move to say, well, actually, there's a third option, which is to say that God's nature is good, and that's why whatever stems from God's commands is good. The problem with this approach is that really it just moves the problem one step back. So we can ask, are the things that are in God's nature good because they're in God's nature, or are they good because of an external standard? So God could have a series of character traits. God could be vicious and spiteful and jealous. And we'd say, well, they're in God's nature, therefore they're good. And that would, of course, not cohere with our ordinary sense of what goodness is. Or we could say, God has a series of attributes that match our external standards of goodness. So relocating the problem to God's nature doesn't get you out of this. So what does secular ethics have to offer? Well, the atheist has a number of different approaches. They're not necessarily required to believe in one particular ethical system. There's a variety that are available to them. I'm going to give you a couple that I think are very plausible. So the first one is grounded in the idea that we all suffer. That suffering is something that all of us have experienced, that when we see suffering, we think that it is lamentable and bad, that we try to prevent suffering, that we ought not to go and inflict suffering upon others. And I think that there's a very good moral theory that can come out of that. In other words, we think that if you were to pull out a baby's eyeballs just for the fun of it and cause the baby to suffer, we don't need to ask why that's wrong. We know innately that suffering is a bad thing. We might think that the morality supervenes upon the fact of the suffering, and that is a good reason not to do that to the baby. And that it wouldn't matter which deity commanded you to go and pull the eyeballs out of the baby, it would be wrong. Another account that you can have is grounded in the nature of beings. So morality can extend not just to humans but to animals. Animals we know can suffer, for example, and we might have obligations to animals not to cause needless suffering to them. But if we think about humans for a minute, I think that humans have this capacity for rationality. that you can reason through various ideas, and because of that you can create what Immanuel Kant calls universal laws. So one path to secular morality is in the categorical imperative, where Kant says, can you will a law that if universalized you would be able to operate upon? So the idea is, can I will that it's okay to lie to someone in order to extract money from them? And he says, well, imagine a world in which everybody lied. Just some.
We're going to stop for...
Sure.
Sorry, we're trying to... Let's do this. We will continue. Mark, you have 10 more minutes. While we try to sort this out, apologies again for the interruption. So we'll settle down. Mark, you have 10 minutes remaining. I'm going to add 1 minute for you. But okay, it seems like it's finally offline.
Well, as a demonstration of my point that suffering is bad. So that's our first secular account, that the presence of suffering is bad, it is an evil and condemnable, and you can build a moral theory based on the presence of suffering, that you ought not to cause it to other people, that you ought to try and alleviate it when you see it. And thank you so much for alleviating that suffering that we've all been enduring for the last 10 minutes. Here's a second account that you can have, which is sourced in rationality. So Immanuel Kant comes up with the categorical imperative. So the idea is that there are universal laws that can guide us, that tell us what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. So for example, if you have the maxim that it is okay to lie to someone in order to cheat them out of money, Kant says, well, you need to universalize the maxim. So imagine a world in which everybody lied to everybody else in order to deceive them into handing over money. What would happen in such a world? No one would believe each other, no one would hand over the money. So the maxim would fail. So just through the process of rationality, you can see that you cannot will such a law into existence, which is that it's okay to lie in order to extract money. John Rawls has a contemporary account of how you can source morality. So imagine this case. You're lying in a hospital bed, you're covered head to toe in bandages, and you've got quite a severe case of amnesia. So you can't recall your sex, your race, your faith, but you have a basic understanding of economics and history. Doctor walks into the room and he says, I'm going to give you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm going to let you set the rules for the world that you step into. But you've got to set the rules first before I take off the bandages. And so you think, I need to act in my own self-interest. So what if I introduced a rule that men have more power than women, or that whites ought to get more property than blacks? Well, maybe if I take off the bandages, I'll wind up being a black woman. So I wouldn't produce such a rule. And so he thinks under this veil of ignorance that you will then generate a set of rules that we track common sense morality. So there you have three different secular accounts that don't require the existence of God, that I think meet those criteria quite well in terms of what is a good moral theory. They're consistent, they cohere with our intuitions, and there's an advantage as well in that you can make adjustments. If you are dealing with something divine, the idea is that the text that was granted to us is immutable. That if it says things which no longer cohere with our common sense intuitions, we either have to try and pretend that they're not there, we have to try and interpret our way out of them, but we're bound by the text. And at some point it starts to look audacious when you're trying to talk around some things that are clear in the text. The secular moral theorist says, well, we were mistaken in the past, that our moral theory wasn't very good. Let's make some adjustments. So you find, for example, that the growth of moral theory is to be more inclusive, to say that our obligations to others extend not just to people of particular sexes or faiths or religions, but to everybody, that we have this of growing egalitarianism. So now I've given you those accounts, and I'm going to talk about some particular moral requirements in the Quran. But first, I'd just like it if that door could be closed, because it's very loud again. Please close the door and not talk. Thank you. Again, you can see the presence of suffering as an evil. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of Sharia law, and I'm open to in the conversation, if I've gotten anything wrong, or if I've given a bad account of the law, please correct me. Let's start with the idea of being an apostate. The idea that if you are Muslim, that you have an obligation to stay in the faith, not leave the faith, and not to rebuke the faith. Now, one of the most well-known apostates, or those accused of being an apostate, was Salman Rushdie. Rushdie wrote the book The Satanic Verses in 1989. It's an enormously popular bestseller, and I think most people are aware of the fact that the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a legal opinion, saying that because of the blasphemous content in the book, and because of the fact that he was a Muslim, that it is the obligation of all Muslims, when they see him, to kill him. And I'm going to read just a little short extract from that fatwa. We are from Allah, and to Allah we shall return. I'm informing all brave Muslims of the world that the author of the Satanic Verses, a text written, edited, and published against Islam, the Prophet of Islam, and the Quran, along with all the editors and publishers aware of its contents, are condemned to death. I call on all valiant Muslims, wherever they may be in the world, to kill them without delay, so that no one will dare insult the sacred beliefs of Muslims henceforth. And whoever is killed in this cause will be a martyr, Allah willing. Meanwhile, if someone has access to the author of the book but is incapable of carrying out the execution, he should inform the people so that Rushdie is punished for his actions. Now, the source in the Quran for this view was in chapter 9, verse 61. Some of them heard the Prophet by saying, he is all ears. Say it is better for you that he listens to you. He believes in God and trusts the believers. He is a mercy for those among you who believe. Those who hurt God's messenger have incurred a painful retribution. Now, there is some debate in the community about whether or not this was a legitimately issued penalty, whether there should have been a trial. We know that Rushdie was driven to hiding for many, many years, up until last year when he gave a talk in America, and while giving the talk was publicly attacked on stage, and his eye was gouged out. So I invite my friends to deal with this question. Is it wrong to be an apostate? Was the punishment fitting? It seems that that doesn't cohere with our ordinary requirements of moral philosophy. In other words, the atheist would never punish someone who ceased to be an atheist, who became a believer, a polytheist or a theist of any sort. We can then think about the publication Charlie Hebdo. So many of the writers and cartoonists of that publication in France were violently executed on the grounds that they had produced depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, again, there's some debate as to whether or not it is permissible at all to produce such depictions, but it seems that if there is such a rule, it can only bind believers in the faith. And to say that those who have breached the rule, who are non-believers, deserve death, strikes me as contrary to our ordinary moral intuitions. Now, what does the Quran say about people who are non-believers? Well, in chapter 5, verse 10 says, as for those who disbelieve and deny our signs, they are the residents of the hellfire. As for disbelievers, even if they were to possess everything in the world twice over and offer it to ransom themselves from the punishment of the day of judgment, it would never be accepted from them, and they will suffer a painful punishment. They will be desperate to get out of the fire, but they will never be able to. They will suffer an everlasting punishment. And to those who say Allah is one in a Trinity, in other words, Christians, have certainly fallen into disbelief. There is only one God. If they do not stop saying this, those who disbelieve among them will be afflicted with a painful punishment. Now, again, it seems odd to think that you should have eternal hellfire, eternal suffering, for failure to believe in a particular God. No secular religion no secular viewpoint would ever require this. Also think that punishments ought to fit crimes, so that there ought to be a level of proportionality, and that there is a failing in this regard. So, chapter 5, verse 33 says, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and spread mischief in the land is death, crucifixion, cutting off their hands and feet on opposite sides, or exile from the land. This penalty is a disgrace for them in this world, and they will suffer a tremendous punishment in the hereafter. The commentary says that in the case of armed robbery, offenders' right hands and left feet are to be cut off. Now, there are some circumscribed ways in which these penalties will be imposed, that you should have people who can testify, you can prove it, things you might expect in a court of law. But I would think that no moral court system would impose your hands being cut off for the crime of theft. We can all accept that theft is wrong, but it must be proportional punishment. In other words, maybe you think a custodial sentence, maybe you think a fine, but having your hands removed seems disproportionate. Now, with regards to sexual ethics, there are some further problems. Chapter 24:2 says, as for female and male fornicators, give each of them 100 lashes, and do not let pity for them to make you lenient in enforcing the law of Allah. If you truly believe in Allah and the last day, let a number of believers witness their punishment. Now, what about having sex with a woman while she's menstruating? The commentary on it's 4:16 says that one who goes into a woman in menstruation or in her anus or goes to a soothsayer and accepts his statement relating to the unknown, then such people have rejected what is revealed to Muhammad. As for a fixed punishment for this evil act, there is a difference of opinions among Muslim jurists, details of which are available in the books of fiqh. Nevertheless, the nature of such punishments reported by them is as severe as it can be, such as burning into fire, bashing under a wall felled over, throwing down from a height, stoning and beheading with the sword. Now, what about homosexuality? Well, again, this is condemned, and the idea is that it is deserving of death. Now, it's not just theoretically deserving of death, that it is practiced in a number of countries that have Sharia law, that gay people are executed. Now, one line is to say, well, it's okay to be gay, we just have a problem with the act of homosexuality. But a secular account of morality is going to say, well, have you caused anyone to suffer by engaging in a consensual act of homosexual sex? No. Have you violated any rights? No. If you were to sit in the veil of ignorance and imagine that you yourself may very well be a homosexual who would like to have loving relationships and sex with others, would you want such a rule that would impose the death penalty upon you? No. So there is a difficulty in that the actual moral views that are expressed in the Quran don't meet what we require of a good moral theory. That they're out of accordance with our intuitions, that they're non-revisable because the claim is that they come from a divine source. And that secular morality provides us with a much better, richer account that can be claimed to be metaphysically true through a multiple range of sources, either through the presence of suffering. It strikes me as a very interesting move that my friend has made to say there is no evil in the world. I would imagine that spending some time being tied up and tortured to death, you would very quickly think there is evil in the world and I'd like to resist it. To claim that there is no evil is such an outlandish claim. It's just said to be entirely amoral, and I think not in coherence with our ordinary intuitions about the nature of reality. But I look forward to a robust discussion. I run the channel Brain in the Vat, which is the philosophy discussion channel with Jason Werbelov, and the nature of our show is such that we try to engage each other in a polite, civil way so that we can both find out what's actually true. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final esteemed panelist is Hamza Jordis. Go ahead.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon every single one of you. So before I get into my argument for God's existence that undermines naturalism, which goes against the idea that naturalism explains reality, and by the way, naturalism cannot explain the hard problem of consciousness, the acquisition of language, objective moral values, and there's a whole list of recalcitrant facts against the naturalistic paradigm. To say that it explains the whole of reality is quite bizarre. But notwithstanding, I'd like to just make a few points. We're going to address every single one of your assertions. But the first point I'd like to say is, with regards to the problem of evil argument, it's a totally false argument. It misrepresents Islamic theism because it assumes that evil has some kind of ontological reality. Evil is real from the perspective of that it exists in our world, but ontologically it's based on the goodness and wisdom of the divine, which undermines some key premises of that argument. Also from the perspective of suffering under a naturalistic account, well, what is suffering? It's just electrons whizzing around. Cold, blind, non-conscious, non-intentional electrons whizzing around. So from a naturalistic paradigm, just like what Richard Dawkins says, and I have respect for him on this particular matter, because he's consistent. In his book he says, it's pitless indifference. No good, no evil. Also, you've strawed man my argument concerning the threefold dilemma. I didn't say God is only good. I said God is good, but the way we argue that, because he's the only deity worthy of worship, and the only deity worthy of worship is the highest form of good, which we could unpack. But also we have another argument against the threefold dilemma. It is a false dilemma, because there is no external standard that Allah has to submit to. And although it is good because God commanded it, his commands are not arbitrary. They're not dislocated away from his nature. That's a false assumption. And also when we look at the reality of God's commands, we see they cannot be arbitrary unless you want to believe that something could come from nothing, or something well designed is actually based on some kind of randomness. And let me explain. God's commands, manifested in Islamic moral and legal law, addresses the moral needs of human beings on a personal, social, and political level. We have over 1,000 years of a great society. Secularism has only existed for what, 90 years or 100 years, maybe more, and we've seen more bloodshed under secularism than any other moment, time, and phase in history. But notwithstanding, the commands of God are like a key that perfectly fit in a lock that opens the door to well-being and functioning for individuals and social harmony. A key is designed for a lock. And just like the key is designed for a lock, the commands of God are designed for our well-being. Therefore, it's completely irrational and absurd to claim that God's commands are arbitrary. To argue that they are arbitrary is equivalent of claiming that a specific key that opens a specific door was actually not designed for that function. So, there's much more to say, so much things were going on, but let me start with what I call the Quranic argument of prior cognitive information. And today, my dear brothers and sisters and friends, I will argue that Islamic theism makes sense of our ability to produce thought and rational judgments. I would argue that the very fact that atheists are interlocutors, can have a thought, can have a judgment, whether it's sound or not, and there's been very unsound reasoning going on today. But the point is, the very fact that you can have a thought and you can have a judgment requires God's existence in the first place. So it's quite interesting that atheists think about denying God, but that very cognitive process requires God in the first place. And now, if I have time, I'm going to talk about why God is worthy of worship. And this argument is from the Quran, and the best arguments are from the Quran. If you go to chapter 2, verses 30 to 33, Allah says, He taught Adam the names of things. Then He presented them to the angels and said, tell me the names of these if what you say is true. They replied, glory be to you. You have no knowledge except what you taught us. You are truly the all-knowing, the wise. Allah said, O Adam, inform them of the names. Then when Adam did, Allah said, did I not tell you that I know the secrets of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you reveal and what you conceal? And the exegetical understanding of this is not just names, but it's concepts, natures, realities, and properties of things. So here's the argument. And by the way, this argument has been taken from my friend and my teacher, Dr. Safruk Chowdhury. He's a well-known academic, and he actually published a paper on this particular topic. So here are the premises. Number one, prior cognitive information is necessary for humans to formulate judgments about things. Number two, the ultimate source of prior cognitive information is either from a human, a non-human, animal, an inanimate object, natural selection, chance, or a non-natural source. Number three, the ultimate source of prior cognitive information cannot be from a human, a non-human animal, an inanimate object, natural selection, or chance. Four, which is the conclusion, it must be from a natural source. And we have two more conclusions. Five, the most plausible non-natural source for prior cognitive information must be a transcendent agent cause that has the property of omniscience, life, and intelligence. And it finally follows, conclusion 6, the non-natural agent cause in 5 that we just mentioned makes sense of the God of Islamic theism. Now here's some preliminary points. The argument that I'm producing today is not claiming that necessarily at every historical stage of human development that it required some kind of supernatural pedagogical agent. I'm saying that the original human required that prior cognitive input. And this is very important. It's like a causal argument, a first causal argument from a prior cognitive input perspective. Also, the premises that I have unpacked, they're not kind of something that naturalists would necessarily disagree with, because we even have in the empiricist and nativist debate a discussion of kind of an innate cognitive apparatus with some kind of linguistic cognitive biases. Now, even the empiricists agree that you do require some nativism, but they're not as extreme, if you like, as the nativists themselves. Also, and just to repeat, we're talking about the initial human being requiring that pedagogical source that gave the prior cognitive information that is required for us to have judgments and thoughts. So let's go back to premise one to unpack. Prior cognitive information is necessary for human beings to formulate judgments about things. Now, the capacity to think, the capacity to have thoughts and to have rational judgments or unsound and sound judgments, you require at least 4 conditions. A reality external to the agent, or a perceived reality. Number 2, sense faculties that sense the reality. Number 3, a properly functioning brain that differentiates the sense reality. And 4, prior cognitive information. If any of these conditions are absent, you cannot have thought, you cannot have judgment. And also, you have to have prior cognitive information in some sense to be able to link that prior cognitive information to that sense reality in order to have a thought and a judgment. Without that, all you're going to have is sensation and sensation and sensation. You're not going to have thought or any form of judgment and adequate cognition. And we can unpack that in the Q&A. Premise number 2. The ultimate source of prior cognitive information is either from a human, non-human animal, inanimate object, chance, natural selection, or a non-natural source. So let's go to human beings. Well, the prior cognitive information that is necessary for thinking could not have come ultimately from another human being. Why? Because we could ask, where did that human being get that prior cognitive information from? And to continue that chain, you have an absurdity of an infinite regress. Non-human animals. Well, we'll be hard-pressed to give examples of an intelligent account of how a non-human animal species could have meaningfully interacted with human beings based on some pedagogical setup or approach. It might exist in the future with some postmodern secular ethics. We'll be marrying animals soon. That's what happens when you change your ethics based on your own desires and your forced understanding of suffering. But the point is, we don't have that set up at the moment, and God forbid it happens in the future. And if it were true that some kind of animal gave us that prior cognitive information or input, well, at the end of the day, it goes back to the regress problem. Where did that animal get that prior cognitive information from? And we know that the infinite regress is absurd, therefore this is not an adequate explanation. What about inanimate objects? Well, inanimate objects do not have cognitive abilities or functions or the ability to teach, instruct, or pass on cognitive information. Just like under naturalism, you can't adequately explain language development. You can't adequately explain the fact that we have inner subjective conscious experiences, because fundamentally under this physicalist reality, it's just blind, cold, non-intentional processes. And at the end of the day, when you have blind, cold, non-intentional processes, you have to now start to explain how we could develop language, how we could develop cognition, how we could develop inner subjective conscious experience. And that is going to be interesting debate. So inanimate objects fail. What about 4, chance? Well, let's cite Dr. Safrook Chowdhury, because he actually gives a beautiful undercutting defeater to this possibility. He says, the major problem with this possibility is that it's not remotely clear how chance can do anything. Chance is not metaphysically a thing, an entity. It has no being and is not a cognizing potency or power. It is a term that is inadvertently endowed with a creative power and efficacy. In fact, for chance to be a candidate for inputting prior cognitive information would be to granted an all-pervasive power reserved only for something that we would describe as living. To do this, however, is to commit the fallacy of rarefication, which consists of attributing concrete characteristics to something non-concrete or abstract. By arguing that chance did X, created Y, and selected Z, obscures something deeply taking place, and that is making chance a cause when it is mere mathematical possibilities in abstracto. In effect, to attribute chance as a cause for originating prior cognitive information is tantamount to saying nothing originated prior cognitive information. What about natural selection? Well, this fails because there is no necessary link between survival, reproduction, and the ability to even have thoughts and sound or unsound judgments. Look at cockroaches. They survive, they reproduce, but they're not here talking about the inner dimensions of spirituality or theism and atheism or debating about moral theory. Cockroaches are just cockroaches, and unfortunately we do have the human cockroaches in the world that cause a lot of suffering, and unfortunately many of them have been naturalists and secularists. But nevertheless, and one would also argue that there is no necessary link between survival and production, even having true reliable cognitive faculties. For example, if I'm the first human, or I'm part of the evolutionary chain, I'm one of your ancestors that walk into a jungle and I have the false belief based on the unreliable cognitive faculties that mushrooms are poisonous, I'm going to survive. But is it true that all mushrooms are poisonous? Of course not. Now the atheists may retort and say, what about evolutionary reliabilism? This is the view that it's more likely for natural selection to select traits that formed cognitive faculties that were reliable and produced true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. However, I will reply by saying, where's your evidence? Why the epistemic privilege? Why? And when you look at the empirical evidence, with all due respect, you have to be radical skeptics, and therefore there is no truth. They claim there is no God, they claim that there is evil. You have to be radical skeptical about these categories. In actual fact, you have to turn into a postmodernist. Now the reason I'm saying this is because when you look at the works of James Sage and many others, and you look at cognitive science today, they're saying that having true empirical perceptions is not conducive to survival and production. So we have to have false perceptions or not totally accurate perceptions. Also, the very fact that you think that you have to have true beliefs that are reliable, and we were developed that way, and selective forces selected those traits is completely incoherent. Why? Because of the fact that when you use your brain to a certain degree, it drains your resources to make specific inferences and deductions, drains your biological resources. In actual fact, it's more conducive to survival and reproduction to do what? To make false generalizations that would facilitate survival and reproduction. We could cite James Sage much later. So, conclusion number 4. Therefore, it must be from something non-natural. Since all the possible naturalistic explanations to explain prior cognitive information fail, the reasonable conclusion is that to explain prior cognitive information is to cite a non-naturalistic explanation. And the non-naturalistic explanation, and this is the conclusion 5 and 6, is that it has to be a non-natural transcendent agent that has the property of omniscience, life, and intelligence. Why must it be living? Because an inanimate object does not contain prior cognitive information, and it doesn't have the ability to instruct the prior cognitive information. And a living being is a rational precondition for possessing any pedagogical attributes. As Allah says, Allah, there is no deity except Him, the ever-living, in chapter 2, 255. It must be transcendent. Why? Because it has to transcend the regress, otherwise it will also require prior cognitive information. As Allah says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. In chapter 41, verse 11, there is nothing like Him. Also, He must be willing, because this means it must be a kind of being that chooses what it wants to do, so it can willingly select the prior cognitive information relevant to and necessary for human cognitive success or any other functional objective. And a choice indicates a will. As Allah says in the Quran in chapter 76, verse 30, but you cannot will to do so unless Allah wills. And finally, it must be omniscient. This living, willing, transcendent agent cause must possess immense knowledge to endow it to other intelligent bearing agents. It must also consciously select all relevant initial cognitive input and justify that selection. As Allah says in the Quran, surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware, in chapter 31, verse 34. And this makes sense of the traditional God in theism in general, and also Islamic theism. And finally, conclude, atheism cannot even start to explain the fact that we can think, have thoughts and judgments. They don't have the key to open the door to rationality. Why? Because atheism as philosophical naturalism has already been dealt with in this presentation. Atheism as a form of evolutionary reliabilism has been dealt with in this presentation. Atheism as a form of scientism has also been dealt with in this presentation because naturalist selection fails. Atheism as a form of postmodernism, well, postmodern principle of knowledge, there is no method to come to an objective truth. Therefore, there is no truth, it's radically skeptical. So you can't even explain truth, thought, judgments itself. Atheism is a priori, it's a priori. It's a first principle. It's a metaphysic. We start with the fact that we trust our reliable cognitive faculties. We say they're reliable. Well, if you're going to play that game, the door swings both ways. Islam's truths are a priori too. But what would you rather choose as a rational agent? A comprehensive explanation of reality that explains your ability to form judgments, and you could claim that that's a priori, or another so-called a priori that can't even explain our ability to think and form judgments. So brothers and sisters and friends, atheism is a failed project in every shape and form. All manifestations of atheism, it can't even explain our ability to have cognition, to think, to form rational judgments. And at the end of the day, the atheist and physicalist universe just reduces the human being to blind, cold, non-intentional physical processes, and it's all pitless indifference. And I would suggest that interlocutors become more consistent and coherent with their worldview and just say, there is no good, there is no evil, there is no right, there is no wrong. Why is truth a value? Because in the empirical world, it's all valueless anyway. Electrons whizzing around. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we're doing now is we're going to let the panelists discuss amongst themselves. It's going to be an open internal discussion. We lost quite a bit of time. We'll try to go 20 minutes and see how it goes. But then I want to bring in our two discussants and just add you two to the discussion. And we'll hopefully have a good fire started. And then we will bring in you as the audience for the final 15 minutes or so of that open discussion. So I'm not sure how you want to proceed. I have questions as well. In fact, let me just give you some thoughts that came to mind. It seems that Hamza, that the argument you gave there is trying to undercut the atheistic project, and I've heard this sort of argument before. In fact, I'm working on things similar, not even in a theological setting. But you're talking about the what would you call it?
Evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah, that's Plantinga's form, but this is not the same. Yeah.
That's the name I was looking for. Which is the idea that naturalism is self-defeating. But there's something quite interesting there. And I'm wrestling with this as an ethicist as well. What is grounding ethics?
Yes.
So I'm trained in the Western analytic tradition. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, why are these moves being made? And my sense is that the specific moves that are being made in, say, deontology and consequentialism,
yes.
They've been made because, let's say, the old way, the religious way of grounding ethics has been jettisoned, and now there needs to be a new starting point. And what you're suggesting is that starting point would be based on faith either way. But you're suggesting that this basis has, first it has let's say, centuries of religious grounding to it, whereas the new attempt to ground post-religion, post-death of God, has an arbitrariness to it that needs to be recognized. I hope I don't misrepresent what you're saying, but I find that quite intriguing because I'm not sure what resources there might be to grapple with what you're saying without accepting the ontology underwriting what you're saying. And this is not just a problem for today's discussion; it's a problem for philosophy in general.
Of course, yeah.
There's a problem of different ontologies competing with each other, and this is actually something for all of you. One of my I would say concerns coming into the room, that we recognize that there are different ontologies in this room, different cosmologies, right? I hope that I'm multilingual in the sense that I understand ontology underwriting your views, and I can understand ontology underwriting your views. But I think as a first step, we first have to realize that there are these different ontologies.
Can I just retort here, because you spent 3 minutes making that point, and we've got 25 minutes for this segment. And I just want to say that when you're talking about morality, and you're talking about Sharia law and all these kinds of things, you mentioned something quite interesting. You said, our ordinary requirements for moral philosophy. You mentioned as well, like you've got deontological ethics, you've got consequentialism or teleological ethics, and then you've got virtue ethics. You pick up a book on ethics, like for example John Mackey, you're going to find this kind of classification. This is a Western classification. You mentioned two men, which are Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, both of which, in a sense, represent the white liberal tradition, both white men from the Western Hemisphere. My question is, why should it be that white men dictate to us what morality is? Have we had enough of this in this country, in a sense that, this is now, to be honest with you, in a veiled sense. If you said our requirements for morality as if we've all subscribed to it, we have a completely different understanding and a completely different ontology. Why have you assumed that the white man is right? What proof that you have that is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative or his hypothetical imperative or John Rawls' veil of ignorance, what you kept mentioning, any of that stuff is true? And what proof do you have that it's objectively true as an atheist? If we can get through this question, then we can talk about Sharia law and the false things that you were saying about it. For example, a woman that's menstruating gets burnt or something like that, or you get burnt by it, or if you have sex with a woman that's menstruating, which is not mentioned in any book of fiqh in Islam whatsoever. And you mentioned it's mentioned in books of fiqh, it's not mentioned in any book whatsoever. Then you mentioned Khomeini, who was an obscure figure. So my question is, as an atheist, you have the audacity to say our requirements of moral philosophy, as if the white man's moral philosophy is all of our moral philosophies. No, we have divine command theory, we have Quran, we have Sunnah, we have our own way of deriving morals. What objective proof do you two have that the deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant and or the veil of ignorance of John Rawls, who's a liberal, both of them are liberal in a sense, and or any of the consequentialist ethics of any of the utilitarian thinkers of the modern day is objectively true?
So first of all, I think you play a very dangerous game when you attach secular ethics to race, and you rob people who are of many races of their human rights.
Like
when you say that it's a white man's game to talk about rights, or to try and abolish suffering.
No, I didn't say it's a white man's race. It's a white man's game to talk about rights. I said that what you've mentioned is a Western form of ethics. Is the ones who the knowledge producers were objectively white men, objectively from the liberal tradition in Europe.
You'll know about the genetic fallacy.
I'm not saying it's false. I'm asking you why it's true.
Yes. So let's first want to deal with this question of him saying we can assess the content of the ideas by looking at the race and the sex of the speakers.
You said our moral philosophy. You've included me in your morality. I'm asking you to prove your morality before you say our morality. I don't subscribe to your morality. Answer me, why is the veil of ignorance of John Rawls or the consequentialist moralities of any of the liberal thinkers or the veil of ignorance or the deontological ethics of Kant is true?
I'll get to it. You're going to have to stop interrupting me. Okay.
And
so
just to add to you, so it enhances your discourse, you also mentioned rights.
Yes.
If you don't mind, I'm assuming you're advocating a liberal conception of rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Well,
do you advocate the UN Charter?
The claim that I've made is that there are three different ways in which an atheist can construct morality.
I understood that. I just want to know specific, because you mentioned rights twice.
Yeah.
And it's very important to unpack these.
The ontological account can get you rights, and a consequentialist account can also get you rights. So
yes, but from the perspective of law, of legal and moral reasoning, and what your views are, so I understand how to deal with you and your beliefs in a positive way, what conception of rights do you advocate? Is it the conception of rights that is known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
So first of all, I haven't expressed the personal view about ethics, and I don't intend on doing that.
Okay, you mentioned rights twice.
Could you say
very nice, but
the reason I'm saying is because rights are connected to morality.
You've asked him a number of questions. Can you just, for the sake of discussion,
I promise not to interrupt you.
5 minutes?
Give him at least
I just wanted to.
a minute.
I do apologize. I just wanted to add to that because that's going to be a follow-up question. So if you think about that, just let us know. Because what I wanted to say was that has a liberal individualist assumption, which many people don't have to agree. And that's why when you come to the table with these universals, it does come across in some way that there's a sign of maybe superiority complex.
Yes, superiority.
And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm just trying to psychoanalyze certain statements in a positive way so we know, and you could stand in the possibility that in actual fact that you may think you're already right. And I want you to stand in the possibility that you might be wrong. And if that's the case, then maybe define your terms a bit more clearer, especially when you're mentioning things like rights. Because rights is a big term, but it has ideological strong constructs. That's my point.
All right, so I'm now going to speak without interruption.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to try and answer your questions as best as I can.
Please.
You're still interrupting me.
I said please.
Yeah. So, all right, let's first of all talk about the different moral frameworks that you can have. I haven't picked a lane for myself, and I don't intend on doing so. The claim that I have made is that an atheist is entitled to claim that there are moral facts, that they don't have to buy the nihilism. You've set up a false dilemma, which is to say that either morality is grounded in God, or there is no such thing as morality, that the atheist is required to say that they're just whizzing atoms and they cannot have any normative force. And what I pointed out is that there are very good secular claims to why there is morality, either grounded in suffering or grounded in human reason, which can generate rights. And by the way, those rights can be spoken about either in legal instruments, so we can talk about rights that are allocated by the UN, or they can just be talked about in the deontological sense. You don't necessarily have to think that the UN Charter on Human Rights is the definitive account, but I think we think a lot of the rights that are in the Charter are pretty good. Now, you can bite the bullet. You can just say, I don't buy any of it. I don't believe in rights. I don't think there's a problem with suffering. I don't like any of the rules that rules generates. And you can just bite the bullet and you can say, there is nothing wrong with putting homosexuals to death. That's just your white, liberal, Western conception of things. And then we're going to have to agree to disagree on that. The point is that you have to bite a very repugnant bullet. That when you deny the major moral theories, that the consensus is going to be against you. Now, it has nothing to do with your race or your sex. While I was trying to explain this, that there's a huge danger in claiming that the liberal tradition or that the moral philosophies that have emanated from John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, or Immanuel Kant belong to white people, or because they emanate from white people, there's something wrong with them. First of all, many people around the world benefit from the notion of human rights. The idea that as an individual, you have a claim against someone else not to do certain things to you. That because you have a right to dignity, it is wrong for someone to intentionally torture you against your will, to put you into a state of slavery. I mean, one of the examples that I gave where I said any person who thinks that morality is external and a good thing would think that slavery is abhorrent. Now, the Quran mentions slavery on many occasions. It does not.
Before we get to that, you've spoken for 2 minutes. Can we respond to one thing at a time? Because otherwise you're just going
Sure,
to go.
Let him finish that.
Let me finish that point.
go
Then we go.
If the Quran mentions slavery, and we'd expect the divine being that either issues good commands or is aware of what is good, to not just have regulation about slavery, but to outright condemn it, to say that no matter the society that you're in, regardless of the place or the time, slavery is always wrong. And we just don't see that in the Quran, and that seems
so
like a failure.
Let's responding. You've completely miscategorized what he said. You've strawmanned actually what he said, which is very surprising considering your level of qualification and education. I'm actually surprised that he didn't say we don't believe in rights or suffering. He said we don't believe in that you can't prove it objectively. Underline the word objectively. As an atheist, there is no mechanism through which you can prove deontological ethics or consequentialist ethics on an objective framework, which is why John Stuart Mill tried to prove the desirability principle in his book on utilitarianism. What I'm saying is that this is the first thing you're going to have to choose. The second thing is, we talk about race and you talk about slavery. Let me tell you something the Prophet Muhammad said. Okay, the Prophet said there's no virtue over a black man over a white man or an Arab over a non-Arab. How comes it took you, I don't know how many years as the white dominance to figure that out? Only 30 years ago you stopped apartheid. So why should we listen to you? In a sense, okay, you're playing the moral superiority card. With all due respect, it took you 1,300 years after the fact to realize that something the Prophet said, Prophet Muhammad, who you're attacking the religion of right now, 1,300 years before, you now agree with him. So how do we know you're not going to differ on these issues? Number two, on the issue of slavery, okay, because when was the apartheid end? 1994, 30 years ago, and they're telling us about this and that. I mean, I don't see how this is working here. Number two, you said this, the emanation and the knowledge production of these ideologies that you're talking about is undoubtedly white and European. You cannot take that away from the reality. I don't think John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham or Immanuel Kant was Nigerian. I didn't see. You're talking about secular ethics. It's not the secular ethics of the black man, is it? It's the secular ethics of the white man. And you've already assumed it to be true, just like many of probably the people before in this country, white men, assumed that apartheid was true. Then they had to, the suffering, by the way, that Mandela and others had to undergo, the suffering, which is good suffering, by the way, because not all suffering is bad. You said suffering is bad. What about the suffering that Mandela and the others, the anti-apartheid activists, had to go through? Was that good suffering or bad suffering? It was good suffering, because then people realized that it's equality and race and things like that. So this is what you're doing here, is you're being morally sanctimonious. You're clearly trying to come with a hierarchy as you explain to me. No, you explain to me why your morality is true in the first place. I believe, yes, homosexuality is prohibited in Islam. It's wrong. Yes, I believe you're going to go to the hellfire if you don't believe in Allah. Yes, I believe that there's heaven. Yes, I believe in the day of judgment. These are things I believe in. Tell me why that's wrong. Tell me why that makes Islam to be true. What creedal disproving implications does that have? As a philosopher, where is your objective morality? Where is your objective reasoning? Where are the arguments? Where is the empiricism? Where is the calculations? Where is the proof? Where is the evidence? That's why I'm asking. Don't assume, because the dominance remains in the Western Hemisphere, and there's hegemony on the side of the Western Hemisphere, that whatever ideology they decide to put down, we're going to assume is going to be true, that you're going to come here and tell us our requirements our moral requirements. That's your moral requirements. You have a religion, I have a different religion. Prove to me that your religion is true. That's what I'm saying. Why is consequentialism true? Why is deontological ethics true? Why don't you come and start with that?
So before Mark response, I just want to make a meta comment about the style of communication that's going on, which makes me very uncomfortable.
Okay.
I'm very uncomfortable with how this has very quickly degenerated into a shouting match. I understood, and I was led to believe by the organisers of this event, that we were going to be here to discuss, in a mature and reflective way, various worldviews. I'm very disheartened by the turn that this has already taken. So I want that noted for everybody to see, because I am not as philosophers, as intellectuals. And for the last 5 minutes, Mark, he's an absolute gentleman, has been shouted at.
Now, this is not relevant, to be honest with you.
Right,
we're talking about God and morality. You've spoken about 10 minutes about why Islam is false.
And again,
can you get to the point, please?
And again, the point is I'm making a meta point.
Yeah, but it's not really. It's not.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to step in. So let me just reset. Let's reset things.
So I want to reset things, and I want to talk about something
Can I say one thing?
That came up.
I will let you. I promise I'll let you. So we did say that this is a discussion, and we all came here wanting to discuss things, and understand that things are heated. I should say that I enjoyed all 4 presentations. I was impressed with the level of philosophy in all 4 presentations, right? And I'd like us, as best as we can, even though these things are heated for all of us, to try to do what we did in the discussions. Yes. Try to argue the point, even if we do not like many things.
I don't want anyone to tell me how to speak, with all due respect. I'm free in this country, I can speak with an assertive voice. I don't need people telling me how to speak. I've not been told that I cannot speak in an assertive voice. A discussion doesn't exclude that. With all due respect, I don't want to be told off. This is a 25-minute segment. And we're not
telling you off.
No, he was for 2 minutes. That is a runaway tactic. He knows that he's got nothing to say about this issue. We came here talking about Prophet Muhammad and Salman Rushdie and homosexuality and attacking Islam. I'm telling you, respond to my arguments. Instead of trying to tell me off like a little boy, trust me, I'm not a little boy. In every single man, I'm a bigger man than a little Why is it that your knowledge is objectively true? Go and answer the question, please.
You have to write it down, sir. So, we haven't settled this yet. So the issue is not being told what to say or how to say it, right? The issue is that there's a structural
apartheid, the way you're being dealt with right now. That's what I'm telling you. I'm not speaking the way I want to speak.
So let me say this. Let me put it this way.
I would like to be dealt with properly here.
Let me put it this way.
You know what I'm saying? So just answer my questions. I don't want to be told how to speak. With all due respect,
listen, I'm speaking to you in a way.
You're being sanctimonious and you're trying to be the schoolboy teacher.
No.
You're not here for that.
No. I actually.
It's why you spent 3 minutes actually in our panel discussion.
My views are closer to yours. I'm not an atheist.
Oh, it doesn't matter what you
My views are closer to yours. And I recognize the issue.
Something to say.
One of the discussants will just say something.
Could I ask? Sorry, because you're the moderator of the show. Can I ask if all of you agree that we can sense that Chad and I, it gives us a chance to think over things, and then we'll get back to our 4 panelists.
So do you want to ask a question?
And then I think, as the discussants, maybe Chad can say,
are you going to come in?
Yes.
Do you want to throw the white towel for him?
No.
Just throw the towel.
Sorry.
Just throw the towel.
Okay, I'm going to bring in. So I did promise Aaron that you're going to finish your point. Okay.
Yes.
So Please do.
I came here to talk about philosophy. I've spent a long time preparing. I read Hamza's book, and I wanted to talk about some interesting things. So perhaps we could do that.
Yes.
Please. So a number of your arguments, and Muhammad made this point about his contingency argument. There was this talk about this problem with actual infinities, which I think it's fascinating. There's a really interesting metaphysical discussion to be had about whether infinities can be instantiated in reality. I know, Hamza, Muhammad, you are okay with mathematical infinities. So you have no problems talking about in a logical space that mathematicians can talk about mathematical infinities, so the cardinalities of infinite sets, or potential infinites that tend towards infinity, like an asymptote. You just think that for some reason those can't be instantiated in reality. Is that a fair assessment of your view? That they can't be instantiated in reality?
Yeah. Yes, to a degree.
Okay, so I want to put forward this argument for discussion.
Yes.
So it's an argument for atheism, and I'm just interested to get both your input on it.
But sorry, before you do this, we've asked a question. Like, with all due respect, I know this was a distraction, but I did ask a question and there was a distraction, so can you answer my question before I answer yours?
Tell you what, why don't we get back to that after he's given his...
Yeah,
his
I have no
point.
problem.
I'm very happy to respond.
We can talk about rights and the objective basis. I have no problem talking about that.
Okay, good. You said that. You're a man of your word.
Yeah, 100%. We'll talk. We can talk about that. We can talk about moral realism and all of that. Okay. So let's just assume X hypothesis that actual infinities can't exist, but they can exist in a conceptual realm of abstract logic and mathematics. Okay. So here's the problem. The problem you might have heard before is that this problem is how does that reconcile with God's infinity? Now, I know, Hamza, you've said that there's a distinction between a qualitative infinite and a quantitative infinite.
Yes.
Right, so your normal response is when you're challenged on this about God's infinity being instantiated in reality, you say, no, that this is a qualitative infinite. There's no separate thing of God that's infinite. It's a way of talking about his acme, all his good properties. This is the problem that I want to pose and see how you guys deal with it. Because I don't know, honestly, I don't think I've heard you respond to this.
Fine.
So the first premise is that God is essentially omniscient. So I take that to be a fundamental feature of Islam. So if God is omniscient, then I take it that he has actual knowledge of all true propositions.
Mm-hmm.
So premise 3 of the argument is then that the cardinality of the set of natural numbers is aleph naught.
Mm-hmm.
Premise 4 is that there's a true proposition about each member or element of the set of natural numbers. Mm-hmm. From that we can conclude that therefore God has actual knowledge of aleph naught true propositions.
Yeah.
Having knowledge of a numerically distinct proposition P entails having a numerically distinct belief about proposition P.
Yes.
Therefore, God has numerically distinct beliefs about aleph naught true propositions.
Yeah.
A belief is an actually existing state of an actual mind.
Yeah.
So beliefs are not mathematical objects and they're not abstractions.
Yeah.
They might be about abstract objects and they might be about abstractions, but beliefs themselves are states of the mind, even a divine mind.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So therefore, God has an actual aleph naught, which is the cardinality of infinity, number of beliefs in mind. But if X hypothesis actual infinities are impossible by the assumption, then we must conclude that God is not omniscient. But if God is not omniscient, then he's not essentially omniscient. And if it's a defining feature of God's omniscience that he's essentially omniscient, then he doesn't exist.
Right.
So it seems to me that the problem, and maybe you will have to retract on the idea of that actual infinities can't exist. Or you'll have a different view about God's mind. Maybe.
No, I don't.
Okay, so that's the argument. So I just want to know what you guys think about
this
that.
has been dealt with extensively in the books of Kalam, actually.
Okay.
This actual question is...
Yes, so let's hear it.
It's actually a good question.
Yes, I'm
actually.
interested.
So I'm going to answer you. Look, so the distinction between quantitative and qualitative has been made... Usually it's a box standard answer that's given by William Lane Craig himself as well.
I've heard that.
Actually, it's connected to the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yes.
Now, the thing is, what is actually problematic about the idea of an actual infinity in the real world?
Yes.
So if you look, for example, at Avicenna's account, and it's interesting, there's a lot of secondary source materials and stuff like that, and other people's account as well, Ibn Taymiyyah being one of them. They don't have a problem with the instantiation of an actual infinity in the real world. They only have a problem with the actual instantiation of the real world considering certain conditions, and I'll tell you what they are.
Okay. Yeah.
So, number one, the condition is that these things they occupy a space-time. And number two is that they coexist. Okay? Number three is that they're limited. Now, let me tell you again, right? That they're limited, they occupy space-time, and that they actually exist.
Right.
So, for example, many scholars of philosophy of religion, Aristotle believed this, Ibn Sina believed this, Ibn Taymiyyah believed this, many people believe, Ibn Qayyim believed this, that there was actually an infinite regress of things. They didn't see it as an absurd, or they didn't believe it was, they connected it with a necessary being. The major differentiation that they put in place was the following. Look at this bottle, for example. This is limited. Would you agree? It's limited in its form.
In certain properties.
Yes,
different
sure.
physical properties.
Sure.
Yes.
So-
It's got a particular arrangement of matter.
So what they would say is that this bottle, which is contingent and limited and dependent, having an infinite amount of these bottles at the same time, okay, that is what would be impossible. Why would that be impossible? Because number one, they're limited. Number two, they're contingent. And number three, that they would have to coexist at the same time. So with these conditions in mind, you see, they would discount the idea of an actual infinity. They would say an actual infinity in these contexts wouldn't work. With God now,
Yes.
he's not limited. So this is already a difference. He's not contingent. So you see, God is necessary, a necessary being by definition
exist.
must exist, but even the attributes of the necessary being, for example, the omniscience, it must be necessary. Telazumi, the
It's essential in any
Right, sure,
world.
but
where it
which
exists.
means
Yeah.
the idea of a quantitative infinity is not only not applicable to him,
Yes.
it's not applicable to him. Number two, it's something which is not applicable to anything necessary. So in other words,
Yeah.
you see, the actual infinity is in the context of limited things which coexist at the same time and which are dependent and contingent. That's where the gripe is. It's not where the idea of as you phrased it, which is an actual infinity in the real world. That's why it's actually, we can believe an actual infinity in the real world only with the necessary existence. It's only an actual infinity in the real world with certain conditions which I just mentioned.
Yeah. No. Okay. So yeah. So no, you wanted to go.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, so you said like the belief, God having a belief
Yeah.
would mean that it's actualized in the real world.
No. What I'm
What were
saying.
you saying?
What I'm
Just clarify,
So yeah. So what I'm saying is that you believe that God is a mind, right?
No,
so
No, we don't.
God doesn't have beliefs. He doesn't have knowledge.
No, knowledge, yes.
Yeah, but there's
Is God? So maybe I'm confused. Maybe
Yeah,
tell me,
so-
is God a person?
so this will be
Is he an immaterial person
well,
or
this
not?
will we
It's
want to
the phraseology here.
Yeah.
That's, some would affirm that phraseology, some wouldn't. But
So so we believe in God's transcendence, right? So
Yeah.
using things like mind and person is something that doesn't really exist in our tradition, especially
shakhs doesn't have these.
yes,
Yeah.
a mind, yeah.
No, person.
A person, yes, sorry. With regards to a person with a mind, yeah?
Right.
That has subtle anthropomorphic connotations.
Right.
So we wouldn't really fixate on the term mind itself, right?
Okay.
That's the first thing. This is why I want to find out what do you mean by God's beliefs and why are you saying that this means that they are actualized? I want to unpack that.
I'm happy to. So my general understanding, and maybe we are talking at cross purposes,
Yes.
because the idea that I've always had of the sort of being that resonates for people, that is cashed out religiously, is the idea that people have a belief that God's looking out for them. He's essentially he's a person, and we are made in his image. And obviously God's not a finite person. Like I take it, you guys don't
He's
believe
transcendent.
that. Yeah, he's transcendent, unlimited, unbounded, necessary, all of those sorts of things.
With the word unlimited,
Yeah.
you have to connect it to an attribute of God, or because unintelligible.
Okay.
So if you say unlimited in mercy, unlimited in power, unlimited in knowledge.
Superlative, knowing no bound.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that I've always understood that when people pray to God, he can answer prayers.
Yes.
God knows the amount of hairs that are on Hamza's head, on your head.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Even though I can't see what's on your head. But he knows what's going on with me and Mark, and these are distinct beliefs. And normally when we think about a justified true belief, we
Yeah.
just go with JTB
Yeah,
theory,
sure,
right?
sure.
Any claim of knowledge implies belief. Right? It's very hard to make sense of what you mean by God's omniscience if we're not talking about propositional knowledge.
Yeah, but my specific question is, so I can know how to address your point
Yeah,
clearly,
yeah.
because I don't want to straw man
No,
you,
no,
understand
that's
you.
right.
So when you say God having a belief,
Yeah.
and then God having a belief means it's somehow actualized in the real world, what do you mean by
Oh,
that?
okay, so
and
let's
how
go that.
and how can
So-
you demonstrate
okay,
that God
so-
has a belief, and by the very virtue he has a belief, it means it's actualized in the real
So
world?
when I say God's belief is real, I mean it in the same way that you think God is real.
No, but
God has. So in other words,
Yeah,
so
okay.
do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Can I go back one step, right?
Yeah.
I know what you're trying to say. You're
Yeah.
trying to say, listen, you have a problem with actual infinities. You're saying that God's attribute of knowledge must be actually infinite because it's connected to quantifiable things which have to, for example, his own self. Let me make it easier for yourself. If he's boundless, then he must know himself, right? So in other words, he must have
It's not quite what I'm saying.
I know, but you're saying that you have a problem. You're saying to me, you have a problem with actual infinities, right? And God's knowledge, you're saying God's knowledge, you claim is actually infinite. So I'm responding to you. I don't have a problem with actual infinity. I'm responding. This is my response.
Yes.
I don't have a problem even in the real world. Listen to what I'm saying. I can see it's logically not always incoherent. Can you see? I'm not going KCH.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing now is you're refuting William Lane Craig's Calancho's logical argument. I'm saying I accept what you're saying here. It's a strong point against the Calancho's logical argument. I grant you it. But what I'm saying is, this is the response. Listen to what I'm saying, please.
Yeah.
You might want to write this down. With all due respect.
I'm listening.
Which is this. I'm saying I have a problem with actual infinities in the certain context. Number one, that the objects of in question in actual infinities, number one, are contingent. Number two, are limited. Number three, exist all at the same time. That's the thing that every scholar of the medieval period
Can you
says.
explain to me? So I'm trying to understand.
Yes, okay, let me explain. Let me explain.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So imagine God created A, then created B, then created C, and goes to infinity. That was Ibn Taymiyyah's view. That's a view in Islam. It's a view in Islam. Ibn Sina believed this.
Right.
Many people believe this. Aristotle believed this. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a view in the philosophy of religion. I'm not saying logically it's fully problematic.
Yeah.
I'm saying the following: saying if you get all those infinities at the same time, all those things A, B, C ad infinitum, and put them all at the same time, the existence of those contingent, limited existences together, that's where the contradiction lies. Why? Because therein lies the absurdities of the part being more than the whole, that the inexhaustible becomes the exhausted, all those things that I mentioned in the presentation. That's where it would be a problem, where the spatial, temporal, time dimension is one, i.e. they all coexist. Yes, all those things exist at the same time, number one. And number two, that they're limited and contingent. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I think I understand what you're saying.
I would like to finish my point, which echoes. So it's a little bit of a straw man to consider the qualitative versus the. What did you say I said in my book? I forgot now.
The qualitative and the distinction between qualitative and quantitative.
In the book, it actually goes a little bit further, and it echoes what Hijab is saying, Muhammad Hijab. It's more about the differentiated and undifferentiated infinite. This is the point. So it's based on temporal, spatial, discrete things, finite discrete things. So there is a fundamental difference. So we accept the actual infinite. We can accept it. But we don't accept it from the point of view that you can have an actual infinite that is based on differentiated things, which is based on the contingency, the limited nature. I want to refer to God. So you say God. So God's knowledge. No scholar on earth will say God's knowledge is limited. Is a differentiated, eternal, limited attribute from the point of view that it's temporal, spatial, and it has these limitations. And that's why I wanted to really find out what you meant by belief and how that actually denies what we're saying. I can't see that the argument that you propose actually is a defeater in this context.
So before you could I'll let you finish your point. We're going to quickly bring in.
Of course.
We're going to quickly bring in Dr. Chad Harris, and then we can continue this with audience questions, perhaps on this point or other questions.
Well, he said he would answer my question.
I'm happy to. I don't mind.
Does he want to do that first?
On the human rights.
Yeah.
If you can manage that.
So do you want me to just rephrase the question? Reframe the question.
About the objectivity.
Yeah. How would you? Because you mentioned deontological ethics and you mentioned consequential, the veil of ignorance of John Rawls. I'm just saying, what is the ontological, epistemological grounding that this is a morality on an objective level? That's all. That's my question. Yeah.
So the view that I would give maybe is slightly different to Mark, although Mark did mention it.
Yeah.
Which is that I think that a good way to ground an objective ethics is to look at the nature of suffering. So when an entity suffers, one of the things that they learn about the suffering, the actual nature of it, is that it has an axiological valence. So in other words, we learn about the axiological disvalue of suffering through knowledge by acquaintance, through our direct acquaintance with the state of suffering. And I think that now we can cash that out in slightly different ways. I mean, some meta-ethicists will cash that out giving a reductive account. So some people will say, much like in the philosophy of mind, we want to reduce qualitative properties to neural states. Certain meta-ethicists think that it's appropriate to reduce suffering to certain the badness of suffering, the normative property, to sufferings. And I think that that's quite plausible. Another way of looking at it is to say that it's non-reductive. So in other words, that the normative property supervenes in a necessary way on the non-normative property of suffering. Another way is to look at it is a functionalist account. Now, all of those various accounts, they're very interesting in meta-ethics, but that's more an in-house debate amongst meta-ethicists. But once you grant that suffering is intrinsically bad, it may be instrumentally good in some cases, but once you grant that it's intrinsically bad, that generates a moral reason.
Yeah, but
okay, so if I can just, I promise you I'm going to get there. So once we have a moral reason that's amenable to rational understanding,
yes,
we can start to think about rights. Okay. Because once we recognize that there's an axiological disvalence or a negative axiological valence to suffering, we can see that that entity has an interest, a moral interest in not suffering.
Yeah, sure.
And that has a rational claim to have a right. And what is a right?
Yeah.
A right is a claim that an entity has to protect its vital interests. And one of the vital interests that it has is the interest in not suffering. Why? Because suffering is intrinsically bad.
Can I
so that's a right generated.
This is the what someone will respond to that. Will say, listen, David Hume style. This is a is-or fallacy, it's naturalistic fallacy. Because what you're saying is suffering you feel is bad, therefore it is bad from an or-is or ought perspective, don't do perspective, teleological perspective, moral perspective. The point is, I don't even grant you the premise that suffering is bad in the first place. Some suffering is good. We all go to the gym and suffer there. Okay. Listen, let me tell you something. So, all due respect, I don't even grant you the premise. We suffer all the time. As I mentioned before, I gave you a live example. Yeah. The people that were the good people in South Africa that went against the apartheid for so many years, decades, I'm sure you're one of them, you're a rights activist yourself, were suffering against the hegemonic power until they achieved their achievement. So I don't even grant the idea that suffering is bad. Listen, hold on. Okay. The point is, you saying that suffering, you feel bad, therefore it is bad, is a naturalistic fallacy. David Hume, who's an atheist himself, said you shouldn't be doing this. That's not grounding objective morality. So now ask the question again. How can you ground objective morality on suffering?
So one response to that is you've conflated the intrinsic versus the non-intrinsic nature of suffering. So in axiological theory, there's two distinctions, important category distinctions that are often made. One is about the intrinsic nature of the intrinsic value of something. The other one is the non-intrinsic. What you are referring to is a non-intrinsic value of suffering. So suffering is qua suffering, qua mental state. The state of being in pain is itself bad in and of itself. It may be extrinsically good in the sense that it helps you to overcome certain things. Like, for example, I can see Hamza likes to train as well, as do I. Really? We like to train in gym, right? So the instrumental value of suffering, we can grant that, right? It's a non-intrinsic value.
I understand what you're saying.
What's the intrinsic value?
Just one more thing. I think what you've done is conflated the psychological and the ethical. Like, for example, what you're saying is that we don't like pain. I agree with you, we don't like pain. Human beings don't like pain. Pain is bad, for the most part. I understand that, but what we're talking about here is a kind of psychological bad, not an ethical, teleological bad. I'm saying, how do you get from the psychological to the ethical? How are you making that jump?
There's another question I think would help this, because I would like to ask you, because I think you've slightly skipped something very important.
Go.
When we say objective, or when you say objective, what do you mean? I mean, because if you ground moral values in a naturalistic paradigm, or you ground moral values in what you would say intrinsic suffering, for example, how does that make it objective? Because my understanding of objective is that irrespective of the whole world, right, if they were to say that, for example, apartheid is right, we would still know it is wrong. Because moral values are out there, so to speak. So they require an ontological grounding. You have to answer two key ontological questions of moral ontology.
Okay.
Number one, what is the source of this moral value? And what makes it mind independent? What you've done, actually, you've just gone round in circles.
So I've got a response.
But wait, one more, so you really understand what I'm trying to say, because this is philosophy, right?
No, we're doing it.
You said naturalism explains everything. So under what naturalistic account? If naturalism is defined as, metaphysical naturalism is defined as, number one, there is no divine. There is no non-physical, and everything can be reduced to or explained by physical phenomena in some way. What you're doing, you're enchanting physical phenomena with some kind of divine attributes on non-physical features. So from that point of view, you'd have to also define what physical properties are or what physical
Excuse me,
processes are,
gentlemen,
because from
sorry,
our understanding,
sorry, just a
they're
moment,
blind, cold,
sorry,
and non-rational.
sorry.
So how can you? So
I
Sorry,
understand your point.
we have 4 gentlemen, time is limited.
Oh, sorry.
And with this,
I wanna
you are
be thorough,
negating all these other people. There's a chair.
Why do you have to
and
say this?
No, no, sorry.
Why do you have to say this? No,
I haven't
don't say
spoken that much.
No, no, no,
Can
please.
we give,
Why do you
can
have
we
to
give
always
everybody a
diminish?
round of applause for that fantastic argument?
Why are you trying to appeal to them?
Sorry, I think you're out of order. I have to override my chair. I think you're out of order. If you're a Muslim and you speak about akhlaq, the
No,
Prophet
please,
spoke about
please. I
character.
think you are out of order. You
No,
are
no.
diminishing him.
No,
You're
I'm not
diminishing
diminishing anything. I'm saying you're negating all these other people who
he's
want
not
to ask
negating
questions
anyone. He's not negating
and you
anyone.
can have a discussion and you will answer them. You cannot negate all these other people who also
negating
came to.
anyone.
I'm sorry that I'm overriding my chair. I'm being out of order by doing that. But I'm asking you to have some respect for others, and then we can speak about religion in totality. So can you let the chair do what he needs to do, and he will come back to and let you speak. But people here need to ask questions too. They
Sure,
can.
sure.
Do not negate them.
Sure.
We were having a
Because
all the way from England
but
to negate
for
them.
limited We have to think of
What
respect
disrespect?
and you have limited
Can I
time.
make a mental point?
Get the
a
chair
more mental
speak.
point?
Get
I
the
think
chair
it's important
speak,
because I
please.
haven't spoken much and we were having a very good
Can I
conversation.
let you
Can you speak?
Yes, sorry.
make that point, and then I want to
Thank you.
bring in discuss it. But I do want to thank you all for that very civil
Thank you.
exchange. I really appreciate
We
it.
will. We'll have dinner.
Right, so directly after
So
the
the point I want to mention is because look, I want to be as authentic as possible, which means I don't have any undeclared negative intentions. And I think, I believe in sometimes of a collective consciousness and energy permeates the room. And from the beginning, prior to this conversation, we had academics saying we need academics on the panel because in an academic university, because we have to academically, and it's not your words, but it came across, we have to academically babysit the panel. And I'm being honest, those were the words. We're here because we're academic, you need some academic professionals to give you an academic input. With all due respect, you have master's degrees, you have PhD, we're almost finishing, he has more degrees than a thermometer. So the point is, the point I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to, and this may be wrong, I stand in the possibility that I'm totally wrong, but I got the kind of feeling that there is almost a sense of, meta type of babysitting going on.
Yeah.
And yes, there was emotions, but I think we're gentlemen. He knows, look,
He's a man.
let me tell you, 100% he knew what he was going to say was going to trigger someone.
Yeah,
I
100%.
guaranteed. We live in a hegemonic liberal secular society that's imposing on the Muslim community, and it's not a neutral space ideologically.
Security
And-
has just said
but-
that we need to wrap up. I'm saying
yeah, I
to
get you,
you,
but I'm trying to say that has to be clear because that's how it has come across from the beginning before we've entered this room, and we're having a really good philosophical discussion. And with due respect, what's your name? The chair has already assessed that we're going to give more time to discussion than to Q&A. It was already agreed. With all due respect, you're subordinate in this conversation, and you should allow him to do his job. He interrupted, which was fine, but you didn't know why he interrupted. Let him interrupt properly. If he wanted to take it to the audience, that's fair enough. But with all due respect, let's not have any undeclared negative intentions. That we're all neutral and equal on this panel and platform. There is no, I'm academic, I'm up here, I need babysitting, you're this and the other. We're gentlemen, we have our own personalities, and let's have a conversation. I just find it was rude that I was interrupted when we're having a really good philosophical discourse here. That's what I'm saying.
Can we? Okay, thank you. We're going to continue with this discussion. Dr. Harris and Dr. Mati are going to be brought in, and I appreciate Dr. Mati trying to bring us in, not bring you in, and then the audience. But please go ahead.
So it's a narrow argumentative point. I'm not going to take sides either way in this, but I felt, Eden started off by presenting an argument that ostensibly is an argument about evil. And then Muhammad came in and said, you denied evil.
Objectively, a substratum.
Okay, and you said actually there's just good and there's a lack of good. So
Yeah.
is the good something that admits of degree, so you can have greater or lesser good?
Yes.
But then the argument still goes through, because all that's needed for the argument to go through is for you to have less good. So
Okay, with all due respect, I think
so the notion of evil is a red herring. That's not how the argument works.
What my point in response to that was that evil doesn't have an ontological status. You cannot it's not substratum, you cannot put it under a microscope. I'm not making a point about the relational type of evil. You can say that evil exists. I'm saying as an atheist, how can you substantiate, my question was, how can you substantiate the existence of something on atheism objectively, which doesn't have...
But that's irrelevant to his argument.
No, I think it's very relevant.
No, it's not.
If he's denying God on the basis...
All he needs for his argument to work is if good can admit of degrees. If you can have a greater or a lesser amount of good, then the argument's a sound argument.
Now, I feel like it's 3-on-1 now, but no problem. 3-on-2, you need to do this, I'm sure you do. No problem, no, it's fine, it's fine. You're a big man. No, it's fine, big man, I will handle it. But what I'm saying is this, you've negated one very important thing, okay, which is the fact that we talked about divine wisdom anyway, which is that divine wisdom is not mentioned in Epicurean types of evil
this
arguments.
Is all irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the logic of the argument.
Excuse me, it's not mentioned in the dilemma.
I'm not asking about
it's
that.
not mentioned even his argument, because divine wisdom in the Arabic language means wada shaykh makani side. Basically, it's appropriacy. What are you laughing at?
This is all irrelevant to the argument.
What's funny here?
You aren't answering the question about the argument.
No, hold on. You're laughing. Why are you laughing for?
Because you are deflecting.
No, I'm not deflecting. I'm answering your question. My question is this. When you talk about God, you're talking about all of the attributes that Muslims speak about when we talk about God, including but not limited to the wisdom of God. Now I'm saying that the existence of evil doesn't negate the wisdom of God, because wisdom is appropriacy. It could be appropriate, unless you want to say it's fundamentally inappropriate, for there to be a world in which evil exists, and that's appropriate because, as Hamza also was saying, you know only the pixel and God knows the picture. Do you have the totality of knowledge? You don't know everything that exists. In other words,
and also from a logical perspective, just to address your point, let's assume that so what Muhammad Hijab means about good having levels is in a kind of a mode of an export into the real world. Good does have levels in the real world, but ontologically, say good is
non-existent.
Good is say it's existent and absolute. Let's assume that, and we have wisdom that's existent and absolute. What we're saying is that evil itself is actually a manifestation of absolute unchanging good and absolute unchanging wisdom, in a real world sense. So even from that perspective, there are theological accounts where you could say, the goodness and wisdom of God actually ground evil in a real world sense, but evil doesn't have its ontological status, is actually good and based on wisdom. That actually undermines the logical argument in my view.
Do you mind if I respond?
And I want a response for that, because there was no laugh, there was like a...
So
it was like, I'm smart. Thank you. Yeah, it was a good one.
So the argument, to be clear, Schellenberg's argument takes divine wisdom into account.
How so?
Okay, so the idea is that prior to God, so let's just put the argument into simplistic terms. The idea is that the theist is committed to three distinct propositions about God. The first is God's unsurpassable greatness. That includes his omniscience, which includes his wisdom, his omnipotence, and his supreme axiological value. Right?
So his omniscience in Islam is different from his wisdom.
Okay, so let's say that also includes his wisdom. Okay. Let's say that part of his superlative brilliance is that it does. Right? The idea is that prior to the existence of any natural world, so the created order, God is independent. This is your point that you want to emphasize, that God is independent of the created order. There's a difference between the creator and the created. Right?
Yes.
So prior to any creation, you have all that is existent is a superlative being. And the core argument that Schellenberg puts forward is that the theist is also committed to what he calls prior purity of God. So in other words, there are no goods in God that have any relationship to evil whatsoever. So God is in some sense axiologically unblemished.
Okay.
So he's pure.
Okay.
And the point that he's trying to get across in this new logical argument from evil is trying to say, well, how do you bridge the gap? If you start off with a being that is superbly great, can't be great, and is axiologically pure, in all goodness, there's no evil in God, there's not even anything that presupposes evil. Mm-hmm. So you may even think that there's nothing like courage in God prior to existence. Okay, but let's not be dismissive. I'm trying to give the argument here. So the idea is that from that state, any omniscient and wise being would judge that all the pure goods in him are better than any sorts of finite goods. And the idea of the argument, the thrust of the argument, is that God would model the world after the goods that are in him. In other words, he would make a world that is more God-like.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, so basically in Islamic tradition, there's different schools of thought. Let me just put it out there, right?
So, gentlemen, I'll let you finish that. We've been given now 7.5 minutes to wrap things up. And I'll let you finish your point.
Let me finish the point. There's different schools of thought. So there's divine, just like in Christianity, like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and so on. They had this is called theodicy, and in that they had the idea of privation. Okay, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim also believed in that. There's divine command theory, which is that something is good because God said it. That's also represented in Islam. There's two ways to answer this question. Let's go with the privation theory for the sake of argument, because there's more than one way to solve this issue. I'm saying the following. I'm saying that, look, if God is all good, it's like, for example, do you see this light over there? You see light, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is goodness is the reflection of the light. Evil is the removal of the light.
Right.
So, you understand. So, good is when God chooses to manifest his attribute of goodness. That is the privation theory of good. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes,
So, it doesn't require him to have an evil in him to remove the goodness or remove the manifestation of it. Do you understand this?
No, I get it. I get the point. But
that's all.
But then there's the point that the interlocutor gave to you, which is exactly that you can run the same argument. I don't need to talk about when we can run Schellenberg's argument without talking about evil. We can talk about there exists a world with a distinct absence of good.
Okay,
and
so what?
So in other words, do you see the point? So the point is, the world falls substantially short of God.
No. Look, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the first, you have to answer this. You just said it.
No, that's fine. Let him argue. Let him answer, and then we can take questions.
Because I do get the feel that he spoke for about 3 minutes. I don't say anything.
Give me your answer. I'd like to hear.
No. So there is a phrase by Imam al-Ghazali, one of the great scholars of Islam. He says that ليس في الإمكان أبدع مما كان. There's nothing in the creation better than what is. This is kind of connecting what you're talking about. Okay, so there's a long discussion among Islamic scholars about what this means. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So because it's connected. So you're coming with good interrogations. I'm not actually dismissing what you're saying. What he's saying is something that Islamic scholars spoke about for 1,000 years. No problem. You're coming with good interrogations. Now the response to that, like Ibn Qayyim wrote a book on that very phrase. Al-Zabidi, because Al-Ghazali wrote this in Ihya Ulumuddin. Al-Zabidi has a long commentary on it.
Can you tell me what the answer that he gave was? Is it possible to tell me what the answer that he gave?
Yes, please. We have to.
Yeah. So I believe that there is a problem with the logic here, and as I addressed the Professor Harris, what I would say is there is an assumption that there is a distinction between ontological good and a real world evil. Is that correct?
It's not quite what the argument is getting at.
No, I'm talking about the assumption of the argument. So what you're saying is there is a good, God has goods, right? He's perfect being good, He's omnibenevolent, right? And there is an evil. Are you making an ontological distinction between evil existing and God's goodness?
All right.
What we would say is, in actual fact, evil itself does not have an ontological existence. It is a manifestation of the perfect goodness and the perfect wisdom. So that's the theistic position of Islam. So the whole logic is actually a straw man of Islamic theism. It would only work if you conflate omniscience with God's wisdom, which there is a subtle difference, and there is an assumption in the logic that there is an ontological difference between good and evil itself has some kind of grounding or ontology. We would say that's not the Islamic theistic discourse. The Islamic theistic discourse is God is good.
Excuse me, we've got 1 minute left. 1 minute. Now let me start. I was supposed to have 5 minutes. It's not going to be. Sorry, and you can call me rude. It's fine. I live with that. What I'm saying.
I'm not going. You're a very passionate person.
I'm going to start with the gentleman outside. It strikes me how we all been talking about God, truth, morality. There are men getting cold outside. It's very cold. Workers, working class people.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I'm telling you that.
Okay, thank you.
So let me see, when we speak about God, morality, where do they fit in? That man told me, we need to be out by 1 minute, so I'm not even going to finish.
Okay, let's go.
He said, no, really,
okay,
we need to leave people, because these people needed to ask questions. But because you have 4 men who are truly interested only in themselves, with their truth, with their correctness, you could have been more humble in the Islamic tradition.
How do you know that? I'm interested in myself.
No, because you've been speaking all alone. So what I'm asking... No,
I'm interested in the truth. I'm interested in the truth.
We need to leave. It's finished.